Hi folks, hope you're okay today. I'm just making a video concerning Noah Adam, and he has made a video called "Responding to the Geriatric Ramblings of Dr. James White," and the sound is a bit poor. I'm just gonna see if I can play it and we can hear it a little bit. But if you Google "Responding to the Geriatric Ramblings of James White," you'll get some of the video. So let's just listen to what he has to say.
And abortion advocates, and really anyone who holds to a secular morality. Basically, what I took from this episode is that this new generation of millennials, which I guess technically includes me, barely, this new generation is a dumbed-down, morally repugnant bunch of heathens who've thrown off the shackles of God belief, which in turn has resulted in things like transgenderism and increased rates of abortion and things like that. And, it's amazing to me that someone so knowledgeable in history fails to see that sort of humorous repeated pattern of, the older generation blaming the younger one for the nation's moral decline. You get a lot of that in this video, and it's really nothing new, right? These sorts of geriatric outbursts have been around for a very long time, right? Old people have always been complaining about the moral bankruptcy of the next generation. But this next generation is different, says Dr. White. This is, well, I'll just let him explain it to you.
This is the first American generation that has been thoroughly secularized. This is the first generation that has been freed from the restraints of a worldview that civilized us. People are wondering, where did this insanity come from? The insanity comes from the fact that when you have a culture that embraces a worldview that recognizes the existence of a creator and hence a moral and ethical law that exists above and beyond the gray matter between my ears, that you have a civilized society. But when you lose that, you no longer have a civilized society. You have a barbaric society.
So let's start with, this is the first generation that has been thoroughly secularized. Dr. White is simply factually incorrect here. According to the Pew Research Center, over half of millennials have an absolute certain belief in God, and nearly half of them pray once or more a day. And granted, millennials do have a lower percentage than previous generations in both of these categories, but it's nothing near the extreme statement that Dr. White makes that this is the first generation that's thoroughly secularized. That's just not true. If they were thoroughly secularized, nearly half would be certain that God exists, and even a higher percentage attesting to the existence of heaven and hell. But it's worse than that, because not only are his facts wrong, he ties concepts like civility and incivility to God belief, which he asserts is necessary for a civil society. This is an embarrassingly simplistic way to approach cultural ethics. It's myopic and it's lazy. You don't have to do the work of nuance. There's no complexity to it. It's as simple as this group collectively believes in God, so of course they're civil. And this group over here doesn't, and so they're barbaric. There's black, and then there's white, and that's it. The irony here, of course, is that Dr. White complains in this video about how millennials are essentially throwing off the shackles of traditional values, and he does this by engaging in deep, very narrow-minded thinking that typically makes millennials run away from those traditional values to begin with. And part of the problem that's typically ignored by evangelical Protestants is the inflexibility of the church. And I don't even mean to necessarily change their doctrinal positions to conform to the cultural zeitgeist, but really even just to listen, to at least try to understand marginalized perspectives outside of the bound of their canon. It's this one-dimensional, sort of simple-minded approach to really complex issues. Think sexuality or being gay, for example. It's that very simplistic mindset that makes people feel less inclined to seek answers from traditional avenues like the church. Both Dr. White and his friends at Apologia Studios are notoriously guilty of this, and probably proudly so. If you go check out their Facebook pages, for example, you'll find tons of memes about gay and transgender people that contain the same sort of shallow, narrow-minded, the Bible says it, therefore I believe it sort of approach. Right? That same simplistic approach to complex issues is also mimicked in many other areas of the American church that we're probably all familiar with. Creationism ring a bell? But I got to go back to this idea.
Okay, let's unpack that. So James White says this is the first generation that is secularized thoroughly. And Mr. Adams is saying, well, that's not true. Statistics show that so many believe in God, etc. I think it is true to say, though, that if you were to do a statistical analysis of the average student in America, that they have become very much secularized. Just because you say you believe in God, it doesn't mean to say that you are a Christian. The devil believed in God. So just the fact that people said that they believe in God in statistics doesn't necessarily mean that they're not secular. The devil believes in God, but he's the most secular person around. Second point that he makes about this sophistication. That's a very simplistic argument that he's making. There's a contradiction there. He's saying that evangelicals are simplistic, but he's sophisticated. Therefore, because he's sophisticated, the evangelicals have to be wrong. That doesn't follow. Just because you're sophisticated doesn't mean to say your argument's correct. Just because you've read a few postmodernist books doesn't mean to say your position is correct. The other thing as well is it's very narrow-minded in his outlook and very, what can I say, he's very, he's trying to make out that he's the one that is sophisticated and cultural and nuanced and reads all these kind of, or has these thoughts where he's more sophisticated in his thinking, and then implies that evangelicals are not. Have you ever read B.B. Warfield? Have you ever read Herman Bavinck? Have you ever read Jonathan Edwards? Have you ever read Alvin Plantinga? Have you ever read Al Muller? These are sophisticated thinkers. Al Muller is a very sophisticated thinker. He's an evangelical, but he's very sophisticated. I myself have studied at MA level. I studied Islam. I studied world religions. I studied postmodern philosophy. So the idea that you're evangelical and you can't be sophisticated or nuanced is prejudice. It shows how narrow-minded you are. Shows how narrow-minded people are who try to make it look as if evangelicals are narrow-minded. I always remember Dr. Wilson, one of the great scholars in the 1930s and 40s in the Old Testament. He wrote a massive work on the book of Daniel, and he was rejected by the scholarly world. His book was never dealt with, and it was a massive, massive, massive work. This guy knew many, many, many languages, ancient languages. He was nuanced in his scholarship, but the academic world rejected him and wouldn't deal with his scholarship. And we're talking really, really deep scholarship. So whenever evangelicals are nuanced, the world doesn't want real scholarship. These are my thoughts so far.
That recognizing the existence of a creator natural law is what makes a culture civilized. Never mind that the distinction between civil and uncivil is married to historically forceful systems of power in which a ruling class assigns particular behaviors and even entire races of people into these categories. They're married to structures of power, and that power shifts over time. Never mind the complexities of moral behavior, the ethical evolution and work that a culture goes through in times of transition, such that what was once considered civil or uncivil is now not. But no, I mean, why contemplate these things, right? It's as simple as, do they believe in you?
So, Mr. Adam, we don't read cultural studies. Oh, my friend. Oh, we don't read culture. I read about culture all the time. Reinhard Niebuhr, Christ and Culture, is a great work. I don't agree with all this theology. Many books written about culture and sociology, psychology, anthropology. I read works by secular writers all the time. So how prejudicial of you to think that evangelicals are not interested in cultural questions or want to discuss the finer minutiae of cultural questions. It's just total prejudice. You've gone to college or university, you've read a few philosophy or cultural books, and you come on YouTube and you attack James White, a very good apologist, Christian apologist, and as if you're painting yourself or positioning yourself as cultural. How much culture do you study? How many books on anthropology or the social sciences have you read? I know many Reformed scholars. I know many scholars that are wide readers in these things. So you're so out of your depth. You're so childish in your attitude. You're really like a spoiled child who kind of thinks that just because he's studied a bit or thought a bit, that you're the only one that knows best. Wouldn't it be nice if you had a humility about you, where you would actually engage and discuss with people of a different mindset? You kind of remind me of theoretical bullshit, an atheist on YouTube who is full of himself, who thinks he's really clever and really smart and loves the sound of his own voice. I think you love the sound of your own voice, and I think you need to get off your high horse. I think you need to go away. I think you need to study and listen to other people and engage with them rather than these nuanced, cultural, sophisticated videos that you're doing, which really just amounts to a bag of postmodern wind. Okay?
It's like Dr. White woke up one day and was like, I got an idea. Let's take entire fields like sociology and ethics, and let's just toss them into the lake of fire, right? Not only should we hurl the atheists in there, but let's do away with, like, nuance as well. After all, as he says at the 24-minute mark of this video, what civilizes is recognition of who we are as creatures of God. But even a God-fearing Baptist can drop an atomic weapon and eviscerate 100,000 a month a day. Did you know that around the time the atomic bomb was dropped, about 70% of the United States was Protestant, about 22% were Catholic? There was a huge cultural recognition of the existence of a creator, and yet we tore the flesh of others much like we've always done. Collectively acknowledging God does not...
I think you need to get your historical facts correct there. At the time of the Second World War, the West had gone through a period of secularization, which began with the Enlightenment. By the time you get to the First World War, Germany and Britain have been infiltrated by evolution and higher criticism. That had a massive effect in America. By the time you get to around about 1921 to around about 1930, many evangelical theological seminaries collapsed under higher criticism and evolution. So the idea that America was God-fearing in around about the Second World War, and that is to be equated with people dropping nuclear bombs, is something that you need to substantiate much more historically, theologically. And I've just given you a broad outline where your understanding is not fully correct in historical detail. I mean, I can give you an example. Princeton Theological Seminary, the bastion of Reformed theology and conservative theology, crumbled at the turn of the 20th century. That gives you an idea of what happened in America in those early years of the 20th century. It was not as God-fearing as you're making out to be. In fact, Gresham Machen, one of the great theologians of that time, was kicked out of his denomination because it was taken over by modernists. So, Adam, your facts, you just don't know your history, you don't know the facts, you don't read theology, never mind cultural studies. And then to say that James White's not interested in cultural studies is just absolute nonsense. I've seen James White in many debates, and I know for a fact that he reads the opponent's writings. When he's debating a Muslim apologist or an atheist, he'll go and read their works. If he debated a few years ago Mithras, and he read the Mithras works. When he's debating about history, he reads the primary sources. So you're just out of your depth. You're out of your depth, bro. You're really out of your depth. You really don't know what you're talking about.
Not make a society any more moral, right? Look at Israel in the Bible. Instead, it allows them to engage in the same kind of heinous acts a secular society might engage in, just, with the added benefit of knowing that they can be forgiven for it. It actually makes immorality palatable. I mean, if you really wanted me to, right, I could pull out that old canard about all of the atrocities committed by collective groups of people who believed in God, and many of whom were devoted Christians. Never suffer a witch to live, that sort of thing. I mean, some of the most uncivil things you can imagine were done by people in even whole societies who had a moral law written on their heart. And that's so obvious that I actually feel stupid telling you that. Dr. White continues by saying that without God.
The thing is, even the devil believed in God, yet he's the devil. What James White is saying, that secular, if we're under the Christian morality, not just in following laws, but actually obeying them from our heart, there's a difference. I think that's what he's saying. And it's a good point that you made about the history of Israel and murders and things that happened in the history of Israel. And then we justify it as moral, but then in secularism. Well, it's a good point. It is a good point to make. I'm just trying to think about a response. I think that the question is, what is a moral act? Where is the authority of a moral act? I think that's the key. If you believe in evolution, there is no defined morality. You can only get a defined morality from God. So if God in history says, do this or do that, i.e. in the book of Deuteronomy, where they're to go into the land and to kill all the enemies, if God says that and they do it, it is a moral act. Now, I'm not saying it's a moral act because of the action, or a moral act because he commands it. It's a moral act because it comes from the nature of God. It expresses the nature of God. If you haven't got that foundation, how can you justify any morality? How can you justify and say that the morality, say, of the Old Testament is wrong? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, but it was a very, very good point that you made. A very difficult point to answer, but it was good.
Cannot be any shared cultural values. That's why whatever the state says is the ultimate good. That's just demonstrably wrong too, right? Look at honesty. Honesty is a shared cultural value. This is why we penalize perjurers. In fact, crime itself, like the whole idea of unlawful acts, rests upon something as simple as a society collectively saying, these are the things we want to minimize. And bless your heart, Dr. White, you don't need God for that. You just need a bunch of people to nod their head in agreement about the sort of society that they want to live in. I mean, even if
I think the whole of this issue breaks down in this is that the collective secular morality that we have today. Jürgen Habermas, an atheist in Europe, said that our foundation is based, moral foundation is based on the teaching of Jesus Christ. So that's from a secular atheist. So when you're talking about this collectivity, number one, the collectivity, the consensus that we have was built on Judeo-Christian foundations. You need to acknowledge that. Secondly, if you're saying that morality is based on the majority of the people or the collective people, then morality can change. It can be overturned by another collective society. So really, you don't have morality. You just have a relativism. So there's no kind of foundation for morality in that kind of thinking.
our mere existence is a shared cultural thing that we value, which is why we collectively.
But you don't explain how we got that shared cultural capital. You don't explain historically how that shared cultural capital came. And that is a fundamental problem in what you're saying.
We decry violence and murder. There are plenty of broad, overreaching areas in which our culture collectively values the same thing, and we don't need to recognize God before recognizing these other things. Now,
no, you do, because your foundation is evolution, and if evolution is your foundation, you need to give an account how you get from the problem of the is-ought distinction. You have to explain, as humans noted and as philosophers have noted, that you cannot get an ought from an is. You cannot get morality from nature. So you as a secularist need to, if you are a secularist, need to justify your foundation. And so therefore you do need God, because you cannot justify your foundation from evolution. It cannot be done.
you may want to argue that God is the necessary ontological foundation for morality or for shared value. But that's a completely different thing than what you actually said. Also, just because people disagree on particular specific.
How can you, I don't know where you stand, but if you don't believe in God, how can you have ontological status yourself? How do you know that your ontology, your being, is who you are, unless it is foundational on a higher ontological foundation? You need a higher ontological foundation in order to give your ontological significance a definition. In other words, how do you know that you, the being of you, is not an imaginary being? How do you know this reality is real? How do you know that your ontology is objective? Without God, you cannot know it. You don't know if you're a ghost. You don't really know if your ontology is what it is. So you need a greater ontological foundation, i.e. God, to give yourself ontological status.
In each of these different areas, or maybe how best to cash out their implementation. That doesn't mean that we don't share common value, and nor does it follow that acknowledging God is necessary for that common value. And it's a silly thing to say that if we simply added God to this cultural melting pot, that things would be any different. Recognition of what God? Your God? Which version of your God? The one that emphasizes grace and the doctrine of predestination, or the one that rejects it and emphasizes freedom of the human will? The one who would have us collectively worship on Saturday, or the one who doesn't care? The one who requires baptism, or the one who doesn't? I mean, division is not something that is going to go...
These divisions that you're making are just irrelevant. The one God is the God who said to Moses, I am that I am, the God who worked in history. And just because there is division in Christians doesn't mean there's division in the understanding of the nature of God. Most Christians, whether they're Arminian, Calvinists, whether they believe to worship on a Saturday or a Sunday, believe in the Trinitarian God. So your argument fails. But it's a common argument that skeptics use, but it doesn't work.
Affirms belief in God. It only magnifies it. Interpretation doesn't suddenly vanish because you throw a recognition of God into the mix. Around the 27-minute mark of this episode, you mentioned that you are fearful that our society has access to things like nuclear weapons and the ability to alter the human genome. All of this, you say, is in the hands of people with no moral guardrails. But wait a minute, there's a difference between no moral guardrails and guardrails that are there, but they're formed with stolen materials. In other words, there's a difference between the collapse into sheer barbarism and anarchy and a culture that recognizes moral imperatives, but they're simply hijacked from a Judeo-Christian framework. I really want to assume that what you mean by this is that a thoroughly secular culture cannot ground the moral and ethical systems that they put in place, because to imply that God is the only candidate for the position of a moral guardrail is just idiotic. Like, I don't kill my next door neighbor not because God tells me not to. I don't kill my next door neighbor because I don't want to harm him or his family. I don't want to cause them that kind of pain and suffering and sorrow because I have the ability to empathize. In fact,
no one says that you don't have the ability to empathize or to care. The issue is, can you justify it intellectually? And that cannot be. You need to justify it intellectually. And if you are founded on evolution, you cannot in the slightest justify secular morality. It cannot be done. It's never been done, and it never will be done. And that's the issue.
In fact, I wouldn't even do it if God told me to do it, right? I would tell him what a shitty moral guardrail he's being, and that my vote goes to the empathy moral guardrail. I forgot what we're talking about now.
Well, those arguments, moral guardrail. Politicians today have become narcissistic, where they're more bothered about themselves, they're more bothered about their image, rather than bothered about their service to the nation. That's an example of how the moral guards have come off, where sacrifice and loyalty have been thrown out the window. And that's because we've lost those Judeo-Christian values in our society.
Okay, so Dr. White brings up human cloning as a recent ethical issue. And this is kind of ironic because we have systems of ethics in place when it comes to things like cloning, right? There's actually ethical work that needs to be done in addressing complex bioethical issues like this. I mean, I know it's really easy to just sit back and go, well, it ain't right for us to play God, or they can't have more than one soul. I know that's really easy to do. But bioethics as an entire field shows us that we take very seriously moral guardrails that have zero to do with what God thinks of the whole situation. Like, we're actually putting in work, right? We're starting from the bottom up and looking at complex moral implications. And if we didn't, if there really was, as you put it, no moral guardrails, then we wouldn't have the apparatuses in place that we do.
You're using words like complex moral guidelines, but you're nebulous. You don't actually give any detail about what you mean. You don't actually give any detail about what the guidelines are, what the checks and balances are, and how the scientists or medical people justify or philosophically those positions. So you're actually making statements that sound as if what you're saying sounds sophisticated, but it's actually nebulous. There's no actual specific detailed information there for us to be able to critique or to answer.
And they're not going to go away in the next 20 years, Dr. White. They're probably only going to get more complex. So here's what I think is happening. It's not that there can't be any moral guardrails without God or any shared cultural values without God. It's that those shared cultural values and moral intuitions are starting to shift. They're starting to move away from your very rigid interpretation of the way the world is. And you don't know how to handle this, and so you complain. And I totally get that, right? It's like when you're a child and nobody wants to play the same game as you that you want to play anymore, and so you take your ball and you go home, right? And on your way home, you mumble to yourself, they'll see soon enough that I'm gone. They'll be sorry, right? And, there's actually a place in your video where you do something like this in this very show. I guess in a recent conversation that you had with a couple of women on the topic of abortion, I think it was on Twitter or something, in that conversation, you mentioned that these two women emphasized their own bodily autonomy in their conversation with you. And that really bothered you. And so here was your classic response on your show.
I have to keep reminding myself that person will stand in the presence of a holy God and answer for that perversity.
And this is exactly what I'm talking about here, right? I have to keep reminding myself that although I'm powerless now to force these people to adopt my perspective, I'm on the team with all the power, and you're going to see one day. That simple deferment of, I can't do anything about it now, but you're going to get what's coming to you one day. That resentment, that centerpiece of your religious tradition has been polished for 2,000 years. And you know what? It's still as dirty now as it was when Jesus admonished his followers to take the lowest seat at the dinner table, so that one day they could take the highest seat, to turn the other cheek when slapped, and to pray for your enemies. And what a wonderfully humble thing to do, especially since we both know an everlasting and eternal punishment awaits those lousy bastards. So you can't help but moan at the state of the culture and complain about it. At the next,
I think that it can be said to be, there is some truth in what you're saying. People can bemoan the way things are and feel that they're losing power. And that is a good point to make. But I think that if you read Romans chapter 1, it's very, very clear that if a society moves away from God, it becomes under the judgment of God. And I think there is a concern amongst Christians that as nations we are heading for oblivion. And it's a genuine concern. And it's nothing to be laughed at or mocked. And I don't think that we're seeing a sophisticated society that is going to solve its problems. We're going to see a society that is, from Romans chapter 1, is moving and has moved into barbarism. If you compare Romans chapter 1 with modern society, we're moving into barbarism. And I think it's sad. And it's not a case of, oh, well, we're powerless and we're just, no. No, that's what the scriptures are teaching, and we're concerned about it.
generation who sees the world differently, because you're powerless to change it. You've lost. You can't really move forward and evolve with the rest of the culture due to the rigidity of your interpretive framework, and so you turn it into a virtue. The only thing you can do is be the boy who takes his ball and goes home. And that's where I think all this geriatric ranting and raving, the sense of moral superiority that's littered throughout this video, this resentment, that's where I think all this is coming from. I mean,
To demonize your opponent as geriatric says it all. In the one hand, you're saying that, in a way, you're saying, well, you know, James White and Protestant evangelicals have lost power, and so they're throwing their ball away and saying we're not playing anymore, or keeping the ball and saying we're not playing anymore. But by you making a title, Geriatric Ramblings, basically what you're showing is a kind of postmodern Philistinism, where you don't want anybody to have a different opinion than yourself. What actually are you offering? Are you offering Jesus Christ? Are you offering life? Are you offering life? Jesus said, I've come to give life more abundantly. Is that what you're offering? What are you offering? A nuanced and sophisticated thinking? Nuanced and sophisticated thinking of postmodernist writers or cultural writers? It's all sophisticated. It's all nuanced. To me, you come across as elitist. You come across as someone who thinks you're superior. You come across as someone who thinks they know it all. And you try to present yourself as some kind of humble person. But if you're so humble, why don't you actually engage with people who differ from you? Why don't you actually listen to them? Why don't you actually engage with them? I mean, what is your agenda? What are you trying to achieve? Where are you trying to go with this? Get a name for yourself because you're sophisticated, culturally nuanced, and get a voice, and oh, look at him. Oh, he's got a nice cap on, and he's nice with his t-shirt, and he's culturally sophisticated. Oh, let's follow him and listen to him. Is that what you want? You want to change people into this utopia of secularism where it's all sophisticated? The Bible says, for the wrath of God is revealed against all unrighteousness. Very simple, Mr. Adam. The wrath of God is revealed against all unrighteousness. But it says in Romans 3:24-25, we are justified by faith in Christ. Christ offers you salvation. Very simple. Even a child can believe it. And the Lord offers you salvation, Adam. He offers you grace. He offers you forgiveness. He offers you love. He offers you mercy. And it's so simple. All you have to do is have faith in him. And you don't have to leave your brains at the back of the door. You can still read your cultural books. You can still read your philosophy books. But you take every captive to Christ. Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Adam, one day you're going to die, bro. And when you die, you can pile up all your cultural analysis up as much as you want. But when you die, you die. And you got to deal with that death. And Muhammad is dead, and Buddha is dead, and Charles Darwin is dead, and Bertrand Russell is dead, and you'll die. But that Jesus died and rose again, and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And that's what you need, Mr. Adam. You need Christ to set you free. You need Christ to give you hope. You need Christ to give you a future. You need Christ to give you a purpose. You need Christ. Let me ask you something, Mr. Adam. Give us evidence about Christ. What do you believe about Christ? Do you believe he died and rose again? What is your thought about Christ? Who is Christ to you? Christ was the Messiah. He was the Son of God, and he died and he rose again. And there's abundant evidence for that. And that is the basis of life, Christ. For me to live is Christ. Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father but through me. He says, I am the light of the world. He says, I am the bread of life. Christ, Adam. Give me Christ. And all the secular books in history, all the philosophy books, all the sociology, psychology, and anthropology. I don't say don't read them. Read them. I enjoy reading them. But they are nothing compared to Christ. They're nothing compared to his riches, to all that you can have in him. For it says in Colossians, he is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And all that you need is in Christ, my friend. So please, humble yourself. Realize your sin needs to be dealt with. Realize you need Christ. God bless you. I've enjoyed listening to you. And I think that you made one particular good point. But I think the rest of your points were very weak. And I think you accuse your opponent, but yet you fall into the trap of the same challenges to him. But thank you for what you've said. I appreciated your comment, your statements, and I hope people will read, listen to this and think about it. I would say go on to Al Muller's website, go on to Legionnaire Ministries, and go on to Reformed Theological Seminary, iTunes, Covenant Theological, iTunes. Go on to my website, jasonburnspreacher.com, 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 and study there, jasonburnspreacher.com. I just want to say couple last things, Adam. Adam, you look a cool dude. I think you talk very smartly, and you talk very crisply. You're very clear thinker, and I think you've got a tremendous I'm out of gifts, bro. You're very talented. You're very gifted. And I just want to say to you, bro, trust in the Lord and look to him. God bless you and have a nice day. Take care.